The African Tax Administration Forum has urged African nations to mobilize domestic resources and tackle illicit outflows in order to address multiple crises affecting the continent. Over the past few years, the African economy has been devastated by multiple crises. These have included the recent COVID-19 pandemic, the conflicts in Ukraine and other parts of the world, the looming debt crisis, rising inflation, and the increasing adverse impacts of climate change. It says, as of today, the climate finance gap sits at up to $127.2 billion annually until 2030, and the economic disruptions stemming from the Ukraine war are set to further increase Africa's financing gaps. It's called on African countries to do more to improve their domestic resource mobilization efforts, adding most of Africa's challenges are partly due to illicit financial flows estimated at $88.6 billion as per the UNCTAD report on illicit financial flows in Africa 2020. So this amounts to 3.7% of Africa's GDP leaving the continent as illicit capital flight. To speak to us more about this is the Deputy Executive Secretary of the African Tax Administration Forum, Mary Baine. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. So we mentioned quite a number of reasons that Africa is facing this challenge, but to your mind, what are the more urgent challenges facing the continent?
Well, thank you so much for having me. Indeed, at this year's Pan-African Conference on Illicit Financial Flows, all that has been discussed, and what I would consider as the most urgent challenges really is to improve domestic resource revenue mobilization through taxation especially. And from the work of the African Tax Administration Forum, we're aware that tackling this in Africa is really a major challenge. So this, of course, is exacerbated by the economic challenges globally, and in particular for Africa, where, the pandemic, the war, the debt challenge are all leading to serious challenges for countries to mobilize revenues for development. So the key issues in tackling illicit financial flows, how to tax highly digitalized businesses, because African countries are largely challenged, especially in terms of capacity, because multinational enterprises engage in a lot of tax planning, achieving equitable allocation of taxing rights at a global level, because developing countries have been struggling, and even the recent changes have not addressed this. Effectively auditing corporate tax avoidance, this is again a capacity issue, and addressing the issue of granting wasteful tax incentives as countries try to fight for the best opportunities for foreign direct investment. These are some of the, the more obvious issues and challenges.
I know you say as an organization that greater transparency is needed just with regards to tax administration, but where is the IFF or the flight of capital most acute? In which areas and which countries are worst off with regards to this phenomenon?
I think the countries that are, well, as you know, Africa is really resource rich. And therefore, for this capital flight is also highest in the countries that have the highest resources. But other than that, there's also the issue of digitalization now, which poses a challenge, because most countries have not quite, wrapped up their minds around taxing the digital economy. And because of that, a lot of the business is being managed digitally, and the countries are not able then to determine what has been traded. And because of this, Africa is losing out. And this, in addition to already key areas where there's multinational enterprises engage in transfer pricing, they engage in tax avoidance, they engage in tax evasion through the different angles. And because of all this, the countries are all struggling. And as I said before, some of these challenges are not just new, but they are challenges that have been existing, and they are just being exacerbated by the fact that the world is getting more globalized, and most of it is happening digitally.
Do we have the requisite skills to do that? I'm talking in terms of the tax officials who are currently charged with dealing with these matters. And as you mentioned, the sharing of information is also important. But do we have a network that would help facilitate some of these objectives?
Yes, certainly. And actually, that is what the African Tax Administration Forum does. So the African Tax Administration Forum, which has been in operation since 2009, tries to build capacity in revenue administrations on the continent so that they become more effective in domestic revenue mobilization. So there are two sides that the African Tax Administration looks at. The first is really the policy. Are the laws in place enablers to collect revenue? Are the treaties in place well drafted and well negotiated? And then secondly, the actual work of auditing and determining that the taxes that these companies have paid are actually what they have paid, what they should have paid, or if they have engaged in any form of evasion or any form of avoidance. So yes, the African Tax Administration is actually in 40 of the countries. Rather, it has a membership of 40 countries, and it's actually presently providing that kind of support in 24 countries in international tax issues. But over the years, we've trained over 40,000 tax officials. So it is really our expectation that the capacity is slowly building, although the African countries are still quite far off in terms of the capacity that is borne by MNEs, because MNEs use the best brains, while the tax administrations are really trying to catch up most of the time.
So, by the technical expertise that can be utilized to stem the flow of illicit financial flows, you're saying that there needs to be a mobilization of domestic resources to fill in some of these financial gaps. In what areas and how?
So, well, these financial gaps, as I said, most of the challenges and most of the resources are lost through issues like transfer pricing, and this is where countries, or rather where multinationals, declare much less than what they should be by actually transferring the gains that they've made in a particular country to a tax haven or a country with a much lower tax rate. So the second is, this is really through tax planning by these companies. The second area that I can talk about is, say, something like trade misinvoicing. And here, the businesses declare a much lower value of the goods for purposes of taxation so that they can pay as little as possible. And that is those are some of the kind of areas that we are looking at. And for purposes of auditing, to be able to audit properly and to be able to determine taxes, you need to have information and to know how these businesses were trading. And so unless you have that kind of information, then you cannot do that. And so part of what we do is to try and help these countries attain information that they can then use as a comparable to be able to tax the company and to tax it properly. So those are some of the challenges that we are grappling with. And then, of course, the issue that you talked about, which is the capacity issue, where tax administrations still struggle, especially with techniques to tax some of the hard-to-tax sectors like the financial sector, the extractives, and the telecoms.
All right, thank you so much for speaking to us. That there is Mary Baine. She is the Deputy Executive for African Tax Administration Forum, speaking to us about illicit financial flows and the impact it's having on African countries and the need to mobilize resources.